els podcasts del Mercat de les Flors.
It's true that I believe in theatre in the sense that I believe that the theatre has a capacity for us to come together and to collectively experience something that might alter how we look at the world or how we look at each other, how we look at social relations.
Tothom és, justament, el títol de l'obra més coneguda de la coreògrafa danesa Mette Ingvartsen. 12 anys després de la seva creació el 2005, en fa la seva versió extended, on multiplica per 3 els 5 ballarins inicials. I així ens trobem amb 15 cossos amb els que crea una orgia plàstica a partir de la desconfiguració de moviments eròtics, de tal manera que la sexualitat humana es converteix en màquina i el plaer en signe lingüístic. Tot plegat acaba sent una celebració de la carn i de la comunitat, on el teatre es demostra com un espai de reflexió i d'utopia. I al teatre, en ple assaig, hem gravat aquesta entrevista mentre donava indicacions als seus ballarins.
Everyone feeling fine today? How are we? No one with issues? Coughing maybe. Okay, so I was looking over...
And then I also like very much to think of the theatre as a kind of space for rehearsing or experimenting with how we could potentially behave outside of the theatre as well. So sometimes in a way I consider it like a place where we can rehearse utopias or a place where we can imagine the world to be different than what it is. And for me that's not a way to not acknowledge the forms of violence or the forms of power plays that go on in the world or the wars that are going on, but it's more a way of trying to see if we can deal with those questions or issues in a space of experimentation and freedom to imagine otherwise, or to so actually many of my works, they have to do with that, of like trying to imagine differently social relations or trying to observe certain forms of social relations and liking them and then trying to expand on that in theatre. So in that sense, I believe in theatre. It's also that I love being in the theatre. And I think that many, like in a way, as dance has now also moved outside of the theatre, it has moved into museums, it has moved into the streets, which some of my work has done as well. But I still really, really love to be in the theatre. I love the attention of the theatre. I also love to experiment with the convention. So I have many questions about frontality. I have many questions about how do we look, how is attention distributed in theatre. So, but I still really, really love to sit in the theatre. I love to create this collective attention, and that's in a way like a pretext for most of my performances.
With someone without making it uncomfortable, right? Like without, somehow penetrating so much that it's uncomfortable.
El joc amb les convencions socials i teatrals que proposa Mette Ingvartsen alimenta un esperit de camaraderia entre els ballarins, que s'intercanvien rialles i abraçades, mentre repassen les posicions i l'engranatge rítmic de la peça. Després els veiem enfondar-se en els trajos blaus de tothom que els cobreixen de cap a peus, la cara també, sense esborrar les formes particulars de cadascun d'ells. Aquesta és una de les estratègies d'abstracció-fusió que li serveixen per analitzar la nostra societat.
No, it's true that the frontality of theatre has lots of hierarchies built into it. It also has passivity in the public activity on stage built into it. And actually many of my performances are about undoing that. So for instance, in The Dancing Public, which is my latest show, the audience is actually with me on stage. And I have built like 3 little stages which are more actually related to how in the Middle Ages they would perform on wagons that could roll in and out of public spaces. And so in a way I deal with that kind of idea of a pop-up stage or a stage that can kind of be improvised or built quickly, that then creates a different kind of relation. So the audience is also standing. They can move around freely. They can change. If they want to be close, they can be close. If they want to be a bit more on the outskirts, that's also fine. If they want to participate, they can. But if they want to watch, it's also okay.
The Dancing Public es remet a les coreomanies, o també anomenades mal de San Vito, una plaga de ballarins descontrolats que es va produir en diferents llocs del nord d'Europa entre els segles XIV i XVII. No se'n saben les causes, es parla de malalties neuronals així com de raons polítiques, però la seva imatge durant els mesos de reclusió que van viure recentment per la pandèmia del Covid era quasi una utopia. Per això, en aquest solo es presenta envoltada de la gent del públic que pot ballar, saltar i cridar amb ella.
A lot of my work has been about also questioning that kind of frontality. But of course, the frontality also functions very well if you're interested in creating fictions, for instance. So certain kinds of fictions are more easily created when you don't have people in front of you that in a way sends you all the time back to the reality of sitting here together watching this thing. So yeah, I've done many different kinds of experiments to get rid of that kind of separation between the stage and the audience. But yeah, I think indeed it depends. Each piece that I do, I try to think specifically about what is the most accurate way of communicating the things that I'm interested in. The questions around power, for instance, also in how I have been working on sexuality, has been a lot about how can we undo the hierarchies of power that are in a way dominant in society. So how can you create an image of how bodies can move differently through positions of power, so be in a position of submission and domination, or switch from one to the other, and that there's a kind of fluidity or flexibility in those kind of exchanges. But there I, for instance, still decided for it to come extended, that I still want to create this image as something we are observing from the outside. Whereas in 69 Positions, which is a solo, I actually invite the audience in, and I'm actually doing it together with them. So I make this sculpture, which is a sexual orgy sculpture, and I invite them to try it out and to see how it also feels. So I think it's in a way different forms of imagining the stage creates very different kinds of experiences, and that's, so I try to be attuned with that. When I start making a work, it's actually very often one of the first questions I ask myself, like, what do I actually want to tell, and what would be the best setup to communicate those things, not only as an image or a visual thing, but also as a conceptual frame for how we are looking. So where is the audience? Also been thinking a lot about participation, different forms of participation, because of course when you're sitting looking frontally, it's also not true that you're passive, right? You're also thinking, you're also participating with your imagination, with your bodily presence, with your attention. I think performers, they know that very well, that the way the audience carries, supports, resists, all those things are very much part of forming how a performance in one night comes out. But of course, it's less explicit than when someone is standing on stage together with the performers. So.
If we could try to be a bit more joyful or light, thinking, and then also something about how we look at people. So.
La nuesa i la sexualitat per a Ingvartsen són eixos d'emancipació personal, així com de plantejament coreogràfic. La dansa no deixa de ser un art de la carn, però el cos és matèria de treball tant com d'hedonisme. Per això, per gaudir-lo en llibertat, cal entendre com es relaciona amb el poder i en com el poder ens ha colonitzat el desig.
So it's also a performative game, right? With like actually looking at someone and feeling, okay, now it's enough, I'm going to shift. So, and yet I have felt, of course, when there's no one, it's hard to do that.
A la conversa, la paraula llibertat apareix sovint per referir-se a la seva recerca, tant coreogràfica com conceptual.
I mean, this notion of freedom is always very complex to define. And I think for me, I've been very helped. Like Foucault has this way of defining freedom as something you need to practice. And he explains it in relation, for instance, to colonized countries that then have to fight in order to become free. But once they have become free, they also still need to continue. It's not necessarily when you become free of one source of invasion or colonization, it doesn't mean there's not other forms of power or domination that can also exist once the colonizers have left. So you have to keep on working on becoming a democratic or let's say a free from different forms of power. And that I find very interesting to think about, that in a way we are all the time in structures of power, societal, different forms of power that are operating on our bodies. And of course, in totalitarian societies, for instance, this would be a place where that power is exercised in a more explicit and more violent way. So in a way, the revolt against the power is more clear. But I think in all societies there are forms, norms, rules, regulations that we are up against all the time. And sometimes these rules have been internalized inside of our bodies. We don't even realize anymore that we are acting according to them. So in a way, in relation to sexuality, in fact, I think that's one of the things where there's a lot of internalized ways of behaving or ways of thinking. This is what I want, but not knowing where the frame of thinking this is what I want, which would be normativity, that kind of has installed a certain way of thinking about desire. So I think in a way, for me, freedom has to do with that. It has to do with realizing what are the forms of power that are operating on my body or our bodies as a societal frame also. And what do we do to keep on questioning those frames or those forms of domination that exist in different ways. Yeah. It's not something that you just, you're not just free. It's like now I feel free. It's like a permanent work that you have to do. So I'm interested. I'm very interested in this question of normativity, codes, things that define how we behave, how we become aware of those things, how we try something else, how we realize that might also be problematic, but in a different way, and so on. So it's like a... and then I think there's something with the body in relation, like how do you treat your body in a free way, in terms of like, what can I allow my body to do? What can I allow my body to do in front of others? Because there's also a lot of conventions around that that exist.
Unsexy.
And a lot of it is disorganized.
Yeah.
And
There was
elbows, a lot. I got in my
There was something in dancer which was really nice, which was like this thing of sticking with the connection, and it was more round, and now it feels a bit more like this. So it was more on the body instead of like rushing around from one body to another, and it kind of works better in the sense that we don't get the elbow thing that you get in your face. And also the sensuality is better.
In relation to sexuality, I think working on it made also sexuality into a work, where before sexuality was the intimate space where you have the idea that it's a private space that is not in the public, and then by doing all this work, where in a way with the performers we are discussing a lot. Can we do this? How do we do this? Is this sex work? Is it not sex work? We're naked on stage. We are dealing with sexual representations. How do we feel about this? Do we want to do this in front of, like, all these questions that come up when you want to do these things. And so I didn't feel more free, like in a way, in the sense that became overly aware of everything in relation to sexual practice or sexual activity. But it was a kind of phase or period. And then in a way I feel also that it's like working through a lot of different cliches around how bodies should behave or act that I feel completely free from now. Or at least I feel I have this kind of space to negotiate those kind of images or definitions. And I don't know if I feel, I don't know. I really don't know.
Els estudis a l'escola belga P.A.R.T.S, on hi va trobar la dramaturga Bojana Chevik, van ser molt importants per confeccionar aquest estil reflexiu que ens obliga a mirar els propis monstres, a posar cara a allò que no volem veure de nosaltres mateixos. Des d'aleshores viu a Brussel·les i molt aviat va presentar-hi les seves primeres peces, Manu al Focus, l'any 2003, un solo d'afectacions desvinculades de cap emoció, i l'any següent 50-50, on 3 ballarines joves porten màscares de vells damunt del clatell i es mouen sempre d'esquenes, creant un monstre que no deixa de ser-nos irònicament familiar.
I'm interested in monstruosity because very often, at least how I've been thinking about it, is about crossing things that are usually incompatible. So for instance, with the old and young, like in our society, you can't be old and young at the same time. Also being a man and a woman at the same time, so like the way the struggles of transgender people, it's also something that our society has a hard time accepting, that there is a multiplicity within one body, one subject, that you don't have to choose for this or that. So I think that's a big issue still in our society, that you have to choose. Are you this or that? Do you represent yourself like this or like that? And many of the people, I'm also someone who think of my identity as a multiplicity, something that can change, something that with time transforms. I'm very interested in transformation, in not being stuck inside of one category, which could be sexual orientation, identity, or it could be age, or it could be I don't know what, like it's like I can be a mother, for instance, and I can work on orgy sexual representations on stage. And for me, that's not incompatible. But many people ask me, how does that work together? And I'm like, why shouldn't that work together? It's like we can be many things at once. And so I think that's in a way a monster in our society, the idea that we cannot be multiple, or the idea that you cannot create connections between opposites that seem to be incompatible, but actually it's just a matter of imagination.
Per a 50-50, Mette Ingvartsen va confeccionar un Yes Manifesto, molt diferent al d'Yvonne Rainer, que encara és aplicable als seus interessos, i on hi diu sí a la invenció, encara que impossible, sí a l'expressió de desnombrament, descodificació i recodificació, sí al no reconeixement, a la no versemblança, sí a la falta de sentit, a allò il·lògic, sí als principis organitzatius al lloc dels sistemes lògics fixats, sí a metodologies i procediments, sí a l'edició i l'animació, sí a l'estil com a resultat del procediment i l'especificitat d'una proposta, sí a la multiplicitat i la diferència.
What I was looking for was something about how to make sense in a different way. And it was a lot related to material, like the materiality of the body, and how to find a kind of material logic within the body that maybe on a more like analytic level actually doesn't make sense, but that you can make it work. And that is still something, so maybe instead of nonsense or illogic, it's like how to, like, yes, to material logics, because to me that's also what I've been working on in a lot of my performances around the non-human, where I work with materials or objects. I'm really looking for how do these materials or objects communicate something else than what we are usually attributing to them. Sometimes people ask me, why are your performances looking so different? Because it's like I do one, it looks like that, and then do the next one, looks completely different. People are like, are you one person? Like, what is this? And I think it is indeed a result of the fact that I work conceptually, and that certain things interest me. So, for instance, the question of collectivity, that's something that appears in all of my works in one way or another. But of course, the collectivity of non-human materials is different than the collectivity of a group of people. So in a way, so that's why also yes to multiplicity and difference still works as well, because I also am very interested in not getting stuck in one form of aesthetics, which of course with time gets more and more difficult, because the more things you make, the more references you have inside of your own work.
L'any 2016, Mette Ingvartsen va acabar el seu doctorat de recerca artística amb una tesi titulada Expanded Choreography, Shifting the Agency of Movement in the Artificial Nature Project and 69 Positions. Aquesta recerca consta de 2 llibres i una sèrie d'actuacions on la coreografia es converteix en un territori d'experimentació física, artística i social. També ha dut a terme sessions obertes de conferències performatives en diferents contextos amb teòrics, científics socials, curadors i artistes per creuar tots els coneixements que incideixen en el cos. La reflexió teòrica va de la mà de la seva creació escènica.
Sometimes overthinking is not really the best when you want to make something. It's like sometimes you really just need, at least me, I need to be in the material reality and in the material ideas, like staging something. You don't need to have read a theory book, I think, but it, for me, it's like more conceptual, theoretical thinking. For me, it's very opening. It's like a super expansive way. I'm very curious. So I read a lot to figure out where the ideas that I have myself in relation to the stage, how I can relate it to how other people have thought about similar topics. So I use it a lot like that. And in a way, the PhD almost oversaturated my desire for that. So when I was finished with it, I was like, ugh. Yeah. Okay, that's fine. So that lightness, we can have. And now I think, in a way, I'm working more with intuition now than I was before. I also work very fast for the moment, which is connected to intuition in the sense of not overthinking everything before doing it. So it has changed, but it keeps on changing also. It's like one project goes like this, then another project goes like that. So it's but I also know that when I need to make something and need to finish something on stage, it's not always so helpful to dive into a book. It's much more helpful to just do it.